In 2017, scientists announced that the Great Pyramid of Giza, a building people have been measuring, mapping, and crawling through for more than 1,000 years, was still hiding a space inside it. A void, at least 30 meters long, sitting high above the pyramid's grandest corridor. No one has been inside it. No one has drilled so much as a peephole into it. The team found it without moving a single stone, and to this day, nobody knows what it is for. That is the strange condition of the most famous building on Earth. We know its height down to the centimeter. Its floor plan is in 1,000 textbooks, and it still has rooms that no one alive has ever been inside. So here is what we'll get to tonight. How do you find a hidden room inside millions of tons of solid stone without drilling a single hole? What did the first treasure hunters find when they tunneled their way into the pyramid 1,000 years ago? And why did the answer bother everyone who came after? Why does the Great Pyramid have shafts too small to crawl through, ending in little stone doors with copper handles? And who seals a door at the top of a shaft no human could ever climb? And what was waiting inside the sealed stone pit that archaeologists opened right beside the pyramid in 1954? A pit that had sat shut, airtight, since the pyramid was new? We'll get to all of it soon. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. And we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And while you're settling in, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I read every one of them, usually at an hour when, with any luck, you're already asleep. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket up over your shoulders, tuck your feet in where it's warm, and come out to the edge of the desert, where the biggest sealed box ever built has been standing under the same stars for 4,500 years. Giza is a shelf of limestone on the west bank of the Nile, right where the green farmland gives up and the Sahara begins. 3 pyramids stand on it, and it's worth getting the 2 big ones straight before we go inside. The biggest is the Great Pyramid, built around 4,500 years ago as the tomb of a pharaoh named Khufu. When it was finished, it was the tallest thing human beings had ever built, and it held that record for nearly 4,000 years. The second belongs to his son, the pharaoh Khafra. Khafra's pyramid is slightly smaller, but it plays a trick on every visitor. It stands on higher bedrock, so from most angles it looks like the tall one. And it kept something its famous neighbor lost: a cap of the original smooth casing near its peak, like a mountain that kept its snow. Every pyramid at Giza once shone like that, cased from top to bottom in polished pale stone. Khafra's cap is the last surviving piece of the view. Hold that picture. Khufu's is the biggest. Khafra's is the one with the cap. Tonight's story lives inside Khufu's, the Great Pyramid, because that is the one that keeps turning out to have more inside it than anyone knew. Now, the inside. And this is the part that surprises people. Visitors picture a maze in there. Painted halls, gold, chamber after chamber of treasure. The reality is that the pyramid is almost entirely solid stone. Every known hollow space in it, every passage, chamber, and shaft added together, amounts to a few hallways in a mountain. Here is the whole tour. From the original entrance, up on the north face, A cramped passage runs down through the masonry and into the bedrock itself, ending in a rough, unfinished chamber deep under the pyramid. We'll climb down there properly in a little while. Partway down, a second passage climbs the other way. It leads up to the Grand Gallery, the grandest space in the building. A corridor nearly 9 meters tall, whose stone walls step inward as they rise, course by course, until they almost meet overhead. At the top of the gallery is the king's chamber. Walls, floor, and ceiling all granite, containing exactly one object: a granite sarcophagus with no lid, no paintings, no inscriptions. A bare stone room holding a bare stone box. Lower down sits a smaller room that explorers long ago misnamed the Queen's Chamber. No queen was ever in it. And above the King's Chamber, sealed away, are 5 low spaces called the Relieving Chambers, which we'll be breaking into shortly with the Victorians. That is the entire known interior. For the most famous building on Earth, it is a floor plan you could sketch on a napkin. Which is exactly why, every time someone finds a new space in it, the whole world stops to listen. Whoever finished the Great Pyramid closed it behind them. The entrance was masked by casing stones. The passage behind it was plugged with granite. The building was designed to be entered once, sealed, and never entered again. The story of the first recorded break-in comes down to us as a tradition, written long after the fact and polished by every century that retold it. So hold it the way you'd hold a good old family story, true in its bones, embroidered at the edges. It goes like this. In the 9th century, more than 3,000 years after Khufu, the Caliph al-Ma'mun came to Egypt from Baghdad. He was a ruler famous for founding a great library and funding scholars. Exactly the sort of man who looks at the largest building in the world and needs to know what is installed it. But the original entrance was hidden. From the ground, the north face showed nothing but smooth stone. So his men picked a promising spot and started tunneling. Understand what that meant. 9th century excavation gear was hammers, chisels, fire, and patience. Treasure hunting on this scale required 3 things: manpower, funding, and a willingness to argue with a mountain. His men cut a tunnel sideways into raw masonry, meter after meter, by torchlight, breathing stone dust, with no map and no guarantee there was anything inside but more stone. The story says they broke through into the descending passage and found the way up blocked by those granite plugs, fitted so tightly a knife blade couldn't find the seam. Granite was too hard for their tools, so they did the sensible thing. They cut around it, through the softer limestone, and kept climbing. From there, the way was open, up the ascending passage, into the Grand Gallery, torchlight climbing 9 meters of stepped stone, and at the top, through a low doorway, into the King's Chamber, the room where the treasure of one of the greatest kings of Egypt's greatest age was waiting. You already know what they found, because I told you what that room contains. 1 granite box, the lid gone, nothing inside. No gold, no king, no curse. Not one of the 3 things a tomb is supposed to owe a treasure hunter. Whether robbers had emptied it centuries earlier, in some break-in nobody wrote down, or whether it was never filled at all, nobody knew. Nobody knows to this day. And that is the moment tonight's story is really about. An empty room in an ordinary building is an anticlimax. An empty room at the heart of a man-made mountain is a question. If the box was bare, where is Khufu? If the chamber was a decoy, what was it protecting? And where? Every robot, every scan, every particle detector in the rest of this story is, one way or another, still trying to answer the question al-Mamun's men carried back out of that tunnel. The tunnel itself is still there, by the way. Tourists walk through it today. It is the standard way in. The front door the builders sealed so carefully stayed shut. Everyone just uses the burglar's entrance now. Before we climb toward the light and the Victorians, we should go all the way down, because the pyramid's oldest sealed mystery isn't above the Grand Gallery. It's underneath the building entirely. Take the descending passage, the one al-Mamun's men broke into, and instead of turning upward toward the gallery, keep going down. The passage is barely a meter square, so you move bent double, the slope steady beneath you, the air cooling as you go. Partway down, something changes around you. The pyramid ends and the earth begins. The passage leaves the built masonry and continues, dead straight, into the natural bedrock of the plateau. The builders drove it on beneath their own foundation, down and down, until you stand deeper below the pyramid's base than a 10-story building is tall. And there, carved out of solid living rock, is a chamber, a wide, low room, and the strangest room in the building, because nothing about it is finished. The ceiling is cut flat and true. The floor never got that far. It rises and drops in rough ledges of half-quarried stone, as if the workers set down their tools mid-shift and never came back. In the floor there is a square shaft, sunk a few meters into the rock, stopping blind. Off one wall runs a low, dead-end tunnel that heads south into the bedrock and simply stops. The most precisely engineered building in the ancient world, the same building whose upper chambers are fitted granite you couldn't slide paper into, has at the very bottom an unfinished basement, which should be some comfort to anyone who has ever abandoned a renovation. Why did they stop? Nobody recorded it. The oldest guess is that this was meant to be Khufu's burial chamber, a room beneath the monument in the older style of his ancestors, and that the plan changed mid-build, with the burial moving up into the pyramid's body, where the king's chamber now sits. Others read the roughness as deliberate, a chamber meant to stay raw, standing for the underworld beneath the king's resting place. And some suspect a decoy, a room dug to swallow the ambitions of exactly the kind of visitors who eventually did come down the passage with torches. The record is silent. Take your pick and hold it loosely. What is certain is the place itself, the deepest, oldest room of the Great Pyramid, farther from daylight than any other, cut into rock that was ancient before the first block was ever laid on top of it. The builders finished the attic to perfection and walked away from the cellar. 4,500 years later, we still don't know which of those two rooms mattered more to them. Now climb back up out of the bedrock, all the way to the top of the pyramid's instay, and jump forward 1,000 years to 1837, and to a British Army officer named Colonel Vyse, a man with money, a fascination with the pyramids, and an approach to archaeology best described as direct. Vyse's favorite excavation tool was blasting powder. Nobody would work that way today, and the pyramid still carries his scars. But what he found in the smoke turned out to matter enormously. Here is what drew him. Back in the 1700s, an explorer squeezing through a crack above the king's chamber had found a low, rough space directly over its ceiling. A crawl space with nothing in it. Its floor the flat granite of the chamber roof below. It was written off as a curiosity. Vyse suspected it wasn't alone. If the builders had left one hidden space above the king's chamber, why not more? So he went looking, with candles, ropes, hired crews, and powder. His men blasted a passage upward through the masonry, and chamber by chamber, he was proved right. Above the first crawl space was a second, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. 5 low, sealed chambers stacked over the king's chamber, one on top of another, none of them ever meant to be entered by anyone. Their purpose, engineers later worked out, was structural. They catch the colossal weight of the pyramid pressing down from above and shed it around the king's chamber, so the granite ceiling below doesn't crack. The builders had solved a load-bearing problem, sealed the solution into the building, and told no one. Vyse named the chambers the way 19th century Englishmen named everything, after patrons and heroes. Davison's chamber, Wellington's, Nelson's, Lady Arbuthnot's, Campbell's. 5 sealed rooms above an Egyptian king's burial chamber, wearing names like the guest list of a Regency dinner party. But here is what makes this smoke-blackened episode one of the most important finds in the pyramid's history. On the blocks of those upper chambers, rooms shut since the day they were built, rooms no eye was ever meant to see, there was writing, not carved inscriptions, paint, quick, casual strokes of red ochre, slapped onto the stones by the crews who quarried and hauled them, leveling lines, position marks, and the names of the work gangs themselves. And woven into some of those gang names, the name of the king they worked for, Khufu. Think about what that is. In the entire Great Pyramid, there is no royal inscription, no portrait, no monument to its own maker. The grandest tomb on earth never once mentions its owner. Khufu's name survives inside it in one form only: the handwriting of his construction crews, in rooms they sealed behind themselves on the way out. Not a king's proclamation, a work crew's paint. The builders signed the building. 4,500 years later, by candlelight, behind Vyse's powder smoke, the signatures were still red. The king's chamber and the queen's chamber each have a pair of shafts. Narrow, square stone channels about the width of a dinner plate, angling up from the chamber walls into the body of the pyramid. The king's chamber shafts go all the way. Follow them far enough and you come out on the open faces of the pyramid. What they were for is still argued about. Air for the workers, or a symbolic road for the king's spirit to climb to the stars. But at least they go somewhere. The queen's chamber shafts are the strange ones. The builders cut them rising from the chamber like the others, and never finished them. They stop somewhere inside the stone. Stranger still, at the bottom, the final stretch into the room itself was never cut. The shafts sat invisible behind a smooth wall until explorers in the 1800s found them and broke through. Channels that begin behind a wall and end inside a mountain. Nobody could say what they were for. And for a long time, nobody could even look, because no human being fits in a shaft the width of a dinner plate. Which is why, In 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink built a robot. It was called Upuaut, after an Egyptian god whose name means opener of the ways. Optimistic branding for a machine the size of a shoebox with a camera on its nose. Upuaut crawled up the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber on little tracked wheels, climbing the smooth stone slope centimetre by centimetre, farther up that shaft than anyone had ever seen. And then it stopped. Not because it broke, because the shaft was blocked by a fitted slab of fine pale limestone, smooth as a door panel, with two small copper pins set into its face, side by side, like a pair of handles. Sit with that image the way the world's Egyptologists did. Far up inside the pyramid, at the top of a shaft no person could ever climb, behind a wall nobody was supposed to find. A door with handles, a door that could never be opened, closed by people who knew no one would ever try. The obvious question, what's behind it, took 9 years to answer, because the only thing that fits in that shaft is a robot built for the job. In 2002, a new robot went up on live television carrying a drill. It bored a small hole through the blocking stone and threaded a camera through, and the picture came back showing a small, empty space. And at the back of that space, a few hand widths behind the first, another stone. The pyramid had answered a door with a door. 9 more years of engineering, and a third mission went up in 2011. A project named Djedi, after a magician in Egypt's own old stories who was said to work wonders for Khufu himself. Djedi was a different class of machine. It carried a micro-snake camera, a lens on a flexible neck, thin enough to pass through the 2002 drill hole and then bend, looking sideways, up, down, even back the way it came. For the first time, the little space between the two stones could be inspected instead of glimpsed. On its floor, Djedi found marks in red paint, the same casual builder's red from the relieving chambers made by masons before the stone was sealed. For whom and meaning what, nobody can say. And then the camera turned its lens around and did something no one had ever done. It looked at the back of the first door. The 2 copper pins, seen from behind, end in small, neat loops. Careful, finished metalwork on the hidden side of a stone nobody was ever meant to reach. Whatever the little doors were for, someone finished the side of them that faced the dark. The second stone has never been opened, and that is where matters stand today. The running score. Humanity has sent 3 robots to negotiate with 2 stones, and the stones are winning. What is it all for? Nobody knows, and the people who study this for a living say so plainly. The serious guesses, the shafts were symbolic passages for the king's soul, and the little doors are doors in the religious sense, thresholds meant for a spirit rather than a body. Or they are leftover pieces of a design that changed mid-construction. Or they served some purpose in the building process that ended before the pyramid was finished. Every one of these has holes in it. The builders sealed the answer where no one would ever see it, and as far as they knew, no one ever did. They were wrong by 4,500 years and 1 shoebox-sized robot. So far, every sealed space tonight has been inside the pyramid. This one was outside, a few steps from its southern face, under everyone's feet the whole time. In 1954, an Egyptian archaeologist named Kamal el-Mallakh was overseeing the clearing of rubble along the Great Pyramid's south side. Beneath the debris, his workers uncovered something with clean, deliberate edges. A long rectangular pit, cut down into the bedrock, roofed with a row of massive limestone slabs. The joints between the slabs were sealed with plaster. Sealed in the real sense, closed since the Old Kingdom, and airtight. When the first opening was cut and light fell into that pit for the first time in 46 centuries, there was no chamber underneath it and no treasure. There was a ship. A full-size royal ship, built of cedar, taken apart, piece by piece, and packed into the pit in careful layers. Hull planks here, oars there, coils of ancient rope laid alongside. More than 1,000 pieces. A complete ship, disassembled and packed flat, with no instructions included. The excavators said you could still smell the cedar. It took restorers years to solve the puzzle and rebuild her, and the thing that rose from those stacked planks was a river ship over 40 meters long, with a high, curving prow. A vessel most scholars read as funerary, built to carry the king on the journey of his afterlife. A real ship, seaworthy in its joinery, made with total seriousness for a voyage no living passenger would ever take. In 2021, it was moved across the plateau, whole, to the new Grand Egyptian Museum, where it stands today, often called the oldest intact ship in the world. Remember why this beat belongs in tonight's story. Every other sealed space we touch tonight is still sealed. The void unentered, the little doors shut. The boat pit is the proof that the waiting can end. For 1,000 years, everyone who forced a way into the pyramid found bare stone. Then an archaeologist, working carefully with brushes and levers, clearing rubble a few steps from the south face, opened a pit nobody knew existed, and out came a ship. Giza was not out of surprises. People had simply stopped asking properly. Which brings us to the question this whole night has been leaning toward. How do you find a hidden room in the Great Pyramid now? Because by the 21st century, every old way of searching had been used up or outlawed. Tunneling is vandalism. Blasting is unthinkable. Vyse's method now belongs to the same museum as Vyse. The pyramid is a protected monument, one of the most protected on Earth. You may not drill it, chip it, or pry at it. How do you search a solid mountain you are not allowed to touch? The answer falls out of the sky. And I mean that literally. So let me spell it out, because it may be the loveliest idea in modern archaeology. Space is full of fast particles. Day and night they slam into the top of Earth's atmosphere, and when they do, they shatter into showers of smaller particles. One of those is called a muon. Muons rain down on the entire planet, everywhere, all the time. They are passing through your roof right now, through your ceiling, through your blanket, through you, by the thousand, every minute, completely harmlessly. They have been falling like this since before there was anyone to notice. Here is the useful part. Muons pass through solid rock too, but not for free. The thicker and denser the stone, the more of them get stopped along the way. A meter of rock absorbs a few. 100 meters absorbs most of them. So, place a muon detector inside the pyramid, in a known chamber, low down, and count the muons that arrive, direction by direction. Physicists can calculate precisely how many should survive the trip through 100 meters of solid masonry from any given angle. If solid stone is all there is above you, the counts match the prediction. But if, from one particular direction, too many muons keep arriving, more than that much stone would ever let through, then along that line of sight, some of the stone is not there. Something up there is hollow. That is the entire trick, and it costs the monument nothing, not even a vibration. You set your instruments in the dark and count what falls from the sky. Some of the detectors are nothing more than sheets of special photographic film, in which every passing muon leaves a microscopic track. They sit in place for months, silent slabs doing nothing but being passed through. And when the films are finally developed, each one holds millions of tiny recorded tracks, a long exposure photograph of the sky shining through the pyramid. After Al-Mamun's tunnel and Vyse's powder, this is the politest break-in in the pyramid's long history of break-ins. In the mid-2010s, an international project called Scan Pyramids, Egyptian, French, and Japanese teams working together, set out to do exactly this. Film detectors laid out in the Queen's chamber, other instruments in the passages, and outside on the bedrock. Then months of waiting while the universe did the scanning. 1,000 years of tunnels and gunpowder were about to be outdone by standing very still and counting. The results came in waves, and the first wave started with a landmark climbers and scholars had squinted at for years. Partway up the pyramid's northeastern edge, about 100 meters above the ground, there is a notch, a spot where the clean line of the corner breaks, as if a bite had been taken out of the pyramid. You can see it from the ground if you know where to look. In 2016, the Scan Pyramids teams reported their first conclusive findings, and one of them sat right behind that broken corner. The muon counts showed a cavity, an open space of some kind, tucked just inside the pyramid's edge, 100 meters over the plateau. The other finding was on the north face, behind the chevrons, the great gabled blocks stacked over the original entrance. There, too, the detectors flagged a void. 2 soft spots in a building that was supposed to be solid. Interesting. Modest. A hint of what the method could do. Then, in 2017, the headline, published in Nature, one of the most careful scientific journals in the world. Above the Grand Gallery, the muon counts showed an enormous low-density space, a void with a cross-section similar to the Grand Gallery itself and a length of at least 30 meters. Remember the scale of the thing it sits above. The Grand Gallery is the cathedral moment of the pyramid's interior. 9 meters tall, corbelled walls, the grandest built space of its age. The muons say that above it, buried in what everyone believed was solid masonry, there is another space with a comparable cross-section running on for 30 meters or more, big enough to stand in, big enough to walk down if there were a way in. Nobody has ever found one. The teams did not take their own word for it. 3 completely different detector technologies, the photographic films, electronic detector panels in the Queen's chamber, and gas detectors outside the pyramid, were run by separate groups and analyzed independently. All 3 came back with the same answer in the same place. That is when they published. It was the first major interior structure found in the Great Pyramid since the 1800s. since Vyse. Now be careful with the word found, because this is where the honest version is stranger than the tabloid version. The void has never been seen, not by a camera, not by anyone. What exists is a measurement, like a shadow on an X-ray. The muon data gives the void a location and a size, but it cannot say whether the space is level or sloped, one long chamber or several stacked ones, rough or finished. The big void, as everyone now calls it, is a certified absence of stone, 30 meters of guaranteed nothing, which, at Giza, counts as treasure. So what is it? The serious possibilities? It could be a relieving space, a giant cousin of those 5 chambers over the king's chamber, taking weight off the grand gallery ceiling. It could be a second gallery. The matching cross-section makes that hard to unthink. And a second gallery would raise the question of where it leads. It could be a construction leftover, an internal ramp or working space the builders used to raise the blocks, then sealed behind them. Or it could be something connected to the burial itself, which is the possibility nobody says too loudly, because that empty granite box has been waiting for an explanation for 1,200 years. The muon data supports none of these over the others. Every one of them is, so far, undefeated. It has also, of course, been drafted into every hidden chamber legend on the internet. Secret halls of records, lost archives, stranger things. The counting supports none of that either. What the science says is exactly this, and no more. Above the grandest corridor of the Great Pyramid, there is far less stone than there should be, and nobody alive knows why. Al-Mamun's men left the pyramid with a question: where is Khufu? 12 centuries later, we still don't have the answer. What we have is the exact address of the pyramid's biggest unanswered space, measured to the meter, entered by no one. The big void may stay sealed for a long time, but the other anomaly from 2016, the one behind the chevrons on the north face, has a different ending. That one we have now seen inside. It took 11 years of patient work. The muon teams narrowed the anomaly down until it had a shape, corridor-like, roughly 9 meters long, about 2 meters wide, sitting just behind the chevron blocks above the original entrance. Then other instruments, ultrasound and the rest of the toolkit of non-destructive testing, pinned its position against the joints of the north face. And then, in 2023, came the finale, an endoscope, a camera on a flexible tube fed carefully through a gap between the ancient stones. Not a hole drilled in the pyramid, a gap the masonry already offered. The pictures came back that spring, and the world got its first look at a space inside the Great Pyramid that no living eyes had ever seen. A bare corridor of rough limestone with a peaked stone ceiling ending in blank walls, unfinished, empty. Its purpose, like everything else tonight, is not settled. The leading idea is that it spreads the weight of the pyramid away from the original entrance below it, or that it relates to some feature not yet found. Hypotheses, both, and stated as such by the people who found it. And I'll say this in its favor: there is something close to perfect about it being empty and plain. This is a space the builders sealed shut, knowing no one would ever stand in it. It isn't decoration and it isn't treasure. It is careful, invisible engineering, work done to last forever and be seen by nobody. For 4,500 years, that plan held. Then we looked anyway and broke nothing doing it. Count the progression, because it is the spine of this whole story. Al-Mamun needed 100 men and a tunnel. Vyse needed blasting powder. The 21st century needed particles falling from space and a camera the width of a pencil, slipped through a gap the masons left. Each century's break-in has been smaller than the last. And the biggest prize is still up there. The corridor was the smaller of the two discoveries, 9 meters, tucked behind the entrance. The big void is 30+ meters of unexplained space, high in the pyramid's body, with no joint in the masonry offering a path to it. The teams keep refining the picture, and the detectors keep counting. If the pattern of the last 12 centuries holds, someone will eventually find a way to look, smaller and cleverer than anything tried before, without moving a single stone. So let's lay the night's inventory out plainly, one last time, and then put it away. Inside Khufu's Great Pyramid, a void at least 30 meters long above the Grand Gallery, found by counting particles from space, entered by no one. A small corridor behind the north face chevrons, seen once through a lens on the end of a tube. 5 low chambers signed in red paint by the crews who built them. 2 small stone doors with copper handles, still shut. An empty granite box that started 1,000 years of questions. And at the bottom of everything, a rough room cut into the bedrock, which the builders never finished and never explained. Beside the pyramid, the pit that held a cedar ship, whole and fragrant, for 46 centuries. Proof that at Giza, the waiting can end, and end wonderfully. Somewhere on the Giza plateau right now, it is deep night. The visitors are gone, the gates are locked, and the muons are falling. Through the dark, through the pyramid, through the void, down into the bedrock. A few of them are ending their long trip inside a detector, becoming one more count in a number that is slowly turning into knowledge. The search never ended. It only grew more patient. The builders finished their work, sealed it, and went home. And their sealed spaces have outlasted every empire that rose and fell around them. Somewhere above the tourists' heads, measured to the meter and touched by nothing, the pyramid's biggest unanswered space is holding its shape in the dark, the way it has every night for 4,500 years. There is no rush. It has kept this long. Let the room stay shut for one more night. Dim the last light. Pull the blanket up. Tuck your feet in where it's warm. Tonight, Kamal, the story rests on the best possible page, the one where the room has been found and not yet opened. Good night. Back, past every kingdom and every empire, past the pyramids, past the very first farm that was ever planted, to a bare ridge of pale stone 11,500 years ago, where a few hundred people are about to do something nobody on earth has ever done before. The hill has a name. In the local language, it's Göbekli Tepe, which means, more or less, Potbelly Hill, named for its round, swollen shape, the way it bulges up out of the flat plain like a full stomach after a very large meal. For most of recorded history, that was the single most interesting fact about it, a funny-shaped hill with a funny-sounding name. In 1963, a survey team from 2 universities walked across the top of it. They saw some broken slabs of limestone poking up out of the dirt and a scatter of old flint lying around, and they made a note that there was probably an old graveyard up here, nothing that couldn't wait. Then they moved on. And you cannot really blame them. A graveyard is a perfectly reasonable thing to find on a hill. It is the kind of answer that lets everyone pack up and go home for dinner. So the most important archaeological site on the planet sat there for another 30 years, filed away under "had a look, nothing special." Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to give it that second look. He had read the old survey notes, and where everyone before him had seen the tops of broken gravestones, something about the shape of those slabs would not leave him alone. So he climbed the hill. He looked at the stone, and he understood, more or less on the spot, that these were not gravestones at all. They were the very tops of enormous carved pillars, and the rest of each one was still down there, standing upright, buried up to the shoulders in the body of the hill. He is supposed to have said that he had 2 choices that day. He could turn around, walk back down, and say nothing to anyone. Or he could spend the rest of his life digging. He chose the digging. He ran the excavation for the next 20 years, and he never really stopped. When the first dates came back from the laboratory, they did the thing that good archaeology occasionally does, which is ruin everyone's afternoon. The stones were old. Not cathedral old. Not pyramid old. The oldest rings at Göbekli Tepe were raised around 9,500 years before the Common Era. Call it 11,500 years ago, give or take. Let me put that number somewhere you can actually feel it. Stonehenge, which most of us file under almost impossibly ancient, is about 5,000 years old. The Great Pyramid is about 4,500. Göbekli Tepe is roughly twice the age of either one. Put it this way. When the pyramids were going up, Göbekli Tepe had already been built, used, and buried for longer than the time that now separates us from those same pyramids. To the pharaohs, this place would already have been an ancient, half-forgotten thing, if they'd known about it at all. And here is the piece that rearranged the textbooks. For a very long time, the story of how civilization began went in a tidy order. First, people learned to farm. Farming gave them more food than they needed on the day. The spare food gave them spare time, and crowds, and villages. And only then, once they were settled and comfortable and sure of their next meal, did they get around to the grand, useless, beautiful things. The temples, the monuments, the carved art, the enormous symbolic projects you only attempt once your stomach is already full. Farming first, cathedrals later. That was the order, and for about 100 years more or less everyone agreed on it. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who had not invented farming yet. The monuments came first, and that single fact landed on the study of human history like a dropped plate. It sent archaeologists back to arguments they thought were settled, and it left a great many careful, credentialed people exactly where it leaves you right now, sitting up a little in the dark, asking how on earth that is possible. So who were they? The honest first answer sounds boring and turns out not to be boring at all. They were hunter-gatherers, not cavemen in the cartoon sense. No clubs, no dragging anyone around by the hair, none of that. These were people standing at the very end of the long age of hunting and gathering, right in the doorway of the settled farming world that was about to begin. They knew their land the way you know your own street. They knew where the wild gazelle moved with the seasons, and the wild boar, and the great herds of wild sheep. They knew which grasses came up heavy with grain you could grind into flour, and exactly when to go and cut them. They made fine, sharp tools out of flint and harder stone. They had fire, and rope, and baskets, and dogs. The dog was the one animal that had thrown in with us by then, the first of all our animal partnerships, already curled up by the fire 11,500 years ago. And they had hands like yours, a back that got tired like yours, a head full of names and grudges and jokes that we are never, ever going to hear. That is worth holding on to as we go up the hill with them, because it is easy to talk about a place this old as if it were built by some different species. It wasn't. It was built by people, the same model of person you are, who would look at you lying there, warm under a blanket at the end of a long day and recognize you on sight. Now, what did they actually build? Picture a ring, a great oval room, 10, 15, 20 meters across, its wall made of rough stone and packed earth. Set into that wall, evenly spaced, standing upright all the way around, a series of carved pillars. And then, in the open center of the ring, 2 more pillars, taller than all the rest, standing on their own and facing each other across the empty middle. These are the famous stones, and they are shaped like a capital letter T, a tall, upright shaft with a broad slab laid across the top, like enormous stone tuning forks, or the world's heaviest doorways with no walls attached. The biggest of them stand well over 5 meters tall. That is taller than 3 people standing on each other's shoulders, cut from a single block of limestone, weighing many tons, hauled upright by hand. Archaeologists have given the best explored ring a plain name, Enclosure D, and it is the one that tends to stop people in their tracks. Because look closely at those 2 tall pillars in the center, and they are not just slabs. Down the sides there are arms, a pair of arms carved in low relief, bent at the elbow. Follow them around to the front, and the arms end in hands, long, careful fingers brought together over the place where a stomach would be, very nearly touching. There's a belt carved around the waist, and hanging from the belt, a kind of loincloth. These pillars are people, not portraits. The tops are blank. There are no faces, but bodies. Enormous, faceless, standing stone people, arranged in a ring, with 2 of them in the very heart of it, forever facing each other, hands almost meeting in the middle. Whoever they were meant to be, ancestors, guardians, gods, the honored dead, someone we have no word for at all. They have been standing in that exact pose, one carved hand reaching toward another carved hand, since before any human being had planted a field. Which brings us to the question you've probably been holding since the start. How? How did people with no metal at all make these? The pillars were quarried out of the limestone shelf that the hill itself sits on. To shape them, people took stone tools, flint and harder rock, and they pounded and scraped and pecked away at the limestone, hour after hour, day after day after day, turning a buried ridge of rock into a standing figure taller than a house. No iron chisels, no steel, no power of any kind except muscle and patience. And then they moved the finished pillars, each one weighing in the tons, with rope and baskets and wooden levers and ramps of piled earth and a very large number of human shoulders, all pulling in the same direction at the same moment, because there were no draft animals broken to the harness yet, and no wheel to put a cart on even if they'd had one. And that very large number of people is the honest puzzle, the one that has never really gone away. A job like this needs hundreds of workers, fed and organized and pulling together for a long time. But the usual picture of this period is of small, scattered bands of hunters who followed the herds and kept moving. So where did the crowd come from? Who fed all those people while they hauled rock instead of hunting dinner? Who decided where each fox and each snake would go and made sure everyone stuck to the plan? We genuinely do not know. That is the silence at the center of this whole place. It is a big, strange, human-shaped silence, and once people started noticing it, it did not stay politely inside the universities. It got out into the wide world. And when a mystery this big gets out, people come to it carrying answers, some careful, some wild, all of them trying to fill the very same gap. We're going to walk through every one of them tonight. But first, two things that might explain how all those people got fed: the animals on the walls and the feast. Start with the animals, because the pillars are covered in them. Carved creatures everywhere, in low relief across the stone. Foxes, a lot of foxes, lean and baring their teeth. Wild boar, tusks out, bristles up the spine. Snakes, sometimes dozens of them at once, pouring down a single pillar like water down a window. Scorpions, tall, long-legged birds, cranes and the like. Wild cattle, the great aurochs with the long, curved horns. And vultures, big, heavy, unmistakable vultures, wings spread wide. This was not a friendly mural of farm animals, because there were no farm animals yet. This is the real bestiary of their actual world, the things that could bite you, gore you, sting you, poison you, or turn up to eat you once something else had finished the job. And these people took the most dangerous, most frightening parts of their world, and they carved them by hand onto the walls of the most important building they had, one careful tap of a flint pick at a time. Fear turned into art with enormous patience by someone who had every reason to be afraid. One stone in particular has become famous enough to earn its own nickname. It's called Pillar 43, and people know it as the Vulture Stone. On it, there's a large vulture with one wing crooked outward, oddly, almost like an arm held up. Around it and above it, there's a scatter of other figures, more birds, a scorpion, and, set right by the vulture's bent wing, a single round disc. Hold on to that circle, because we are going to come back to it later tonight. Some people believe it is the single most important circle ever carved by a human being. But here is the honest, slightly maddening truth about all of it. We do not know what any of it means. Not really. We don't know whether the foxes were dangerous spirits or friendly ones, whether the snake's art stood for death or water or family, whether the vulture stone is a story, a calendar, a gravestone, or a doodle that happened to get famous. The people who could have told us have been gone for 11,500 years, and they left their pictures without a single word of caption. It is the strangest kind of intimacy, a whole language of images made by hands like ours, sitting right there in front of us, close enough to touch, too old to read. So what was this place? When the world first heard about Göbekli Tepe, it arrived with a headline already attached, and the headline was 3 words long: World's First Temple. And you can see exactly why it stuck. Giant stone figures, standing in rings, covered in sacred-looking animals, built by people who hadn't even settled down yet. Of course, it's a temple, the oldest holy place on earth. It is a wonderful, clean, magazine cover idea. But the people who actually dig there have spent the years since carefully taking that headline apart, because the longer they dig, the more ordinary life they keep finding mixed in among the giant stones. Hearths where cooking fires burned, old rubbish heaps, which are the single most reliable sign that human beings were living somewhere, for the simple reason that human beings produce garbage. Grinding stones by the thousand for crushing wild grain into meal. Heaps of flint debris, the leftovers of people sitting and making tools. Channels cut into the rock to catch and hold rainwater. This is not an empty temple that wandering nomads visited once a year and left spotless. People worked here and lived here, or right up against here. And that points at the warmest answer of the 3, the one I keep coming back to. Look at all that food being processed. Grinding stones everywhere, big stone troughs and vessels, mountains of animal bone, the remains of wild grain handled at a scale far past what a single family eats for dinner. A lot of researchers now think a big part of what drew those scattered people to the hill over and over, year after year, was a feast, a gathering. You come in from the herds and the wild fields, you meet the other bands you only see a few times a year. You eat together until you can't move, and while everyone is here and fed and in a good mood, you all put your backs into the next stretch of wall, the next pillar. That is one very human answer to who fed the crowd. They fed each other. The building and the feasting and the coming together were all the same act. So the careful archaeologists have traded the word temple for a more careful one. They call the big rings communal, gathering places, special buildings, yes, but built by and for a scattered people who came together here and, for a while, felt like one people, which is, if anything, a warmer idea than a temple. Not priests and a god so much as a crowd, and a fire, and a feast, and the most ambitious building project any of them had ever seen, going up a little more each time they met. And here the story splits. Because a place this old, this strange, this seemingly impossible, does not just sit on its hill being mysterious. people build theories on top of it, the way those first people built rings of stone. And over the last 30 years, 4 big ones have gone up. Some come from the careful folk with the trowels and the brushes. Some come from very late-night television. We are going to walk through all 4, give each one its best possible day in court, and then tell you, honestly, where the evidence really stands. Get comfortable. This is the part everybody argues about. The first theory comes from Klaus Schmidt himself, the archaeologist who spent the better part of 20 years digging the place up. So of the 4, it walks in with the best credentials. He argued it in his own books and papers, and it became the headline that carried Göbekli Tepe around the world. He liked to put it in 5 words. First came the temple, then the city. Here is what he meant, laid out properly. Everyone had always assumed farming came first, and the grand building came much later, once people were settled and fed and sure of the next meal. But the rings on this hill went up before farming, so Schmidt turned the question around. Instead of asking what these people could afford to build, he asked what the building itself might have done to them. And he proposed a mechanism, a chain of cause and effect that runs like this. Raising these rings took hundreds of people, gathered in one place, fed for weeks or months at a stretch, coming back season after season for generations. You cannot feed a standing crowd like that by hunting alone, because the herds keep moving and the wild harvest is scattered and brief. But the hills around Göbekli Tepe happened to be thick with the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, growing in dense natural stands. If you needed to keep the same crowd fed in the same spot, year on year, the natural thing to do is to start managing those wild grasses, protecting a patch, clearing it, scattering seed where you want it, coming back to harvest on purpose. Do that for enough generations, without anyone ever sitting down and deciding to invent agriculture. And you have invented agriculture. And this corner of the world is, in fact, one of the places where farming really did first take hold. So in Schmidt's telling, the gathering came first, and farming grew up around it as the way to keep the gathering fed. The temple did not wait for the harvest. The harvest was invented to serve the temple. It is a genuinely beautiful idea, and you can feel why it electrified people when he first said it out loud, that the very first thing our species settled down for was not bread, but meaning, and the bread came along afterward to keep the meaning fed. So where does that idea stand today? Softer than it did when Schmidt first lit it up. The same years of digging that turned up all those hearths and grinding stones and rubbish heaps also complicated his clean, dramatic story. The more they find, the less it looks like a lonely temple raised by pure wandering nomads who happened to invent farming on the side, and the more it looks like a place where people were already part settled, already halfway into the new world, gathering and feasting and building and edging toward farming all at the same time. So religion-built civilization has cooled into something more tangled and more honest. That worship and settling down and farming all came up together, braided over centuries, and we are still working out which strand pulled which. Less of a thunderclap. And to a lot of people, including me, more interesting, because it means nobody planned it. It just grew. The second theory is the one that put Göbekli Tepe on 100 magazine covers and a great deal of television. And it starts with that round disc we set aside, the one carved beside the vulture's wing on Pillar 43. It comes from two researchers at the University of Edinburgh, an engineer named Sweatman and his colleague Tsikritsis, who published a paper arguing that the vulture stone is not decoration at all. It is, they say, a message, a date written in animals. Here is how their reading works. They treat the carved creatures on Pillar 43 as symbols for groups of stars, the way we draw a scorpion for the constellation Scorpius or a bull for Taurus. Read that way, they argue. The particular arrangement of animals on the stone matches the night sky as it would have looked at one specific moment, a moment they calculate, from the slow wobble of the stars across the ages at around 11,000 years before the Common Era. And that date, they point out, lands right on top of something real. Around then, the Earth was passing through the torrid meteor stream, a wide band of comet debris. Our planet still crosses twice a year. And around then, the climate took a sudden, savage turn back toward the cold, the long freeze the scientists call the Younger Dryas. So Sweatman and his colleague proposed that the vulture stone records a comet strike, a swarm of fragments coming down out of the torrids, remembered and carved by the survivors as both a date and a warning. The round disc beside the vulture, in their reading, is the comet itself. And you can feel why it caught fire, because it is so specific. It is not a vague, ancient people were wise. It is a date, a named meteor stream, and a climate disaster in the geological record that all seem to line up. When the pieces click together like that, it stops feeling like a guess and starts feeling like a code somebody finally cracked. So here is where it sits, and the honest note comes, as it so often does, from the people who actually dig the hill. Two of the lead archaeologists, Jens Notroff and Oliver Dietrich, published a direct reply to the Comet paper, with the rather pointed title, More Than a Vulture. Their objections were every bit as specific as the claim. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe, they pointed out, were not made in a single moment. They are spread across many pillars in many buildings, cut and recut over centuries. So reading one pillar as a snapshot of one night sky ignores how the whole place actually grew. The match between animals and constellations isn't fixed either. If you are free to choose which creatures count as stars and which patch of sky to lay them against, you can find very nearly any date you go looking for. And the famous disk carries no label telling us it is a comet. It could be the sun, or the moon, or one of the round objects that turn up elsewhere on the site, or something we simply have no word for. So it is not the accepted explanation. But, and this is exactly why it earns its airtime tonight, it is not a foolish idea either. And it is a wonderful thing to lie here in the dark and weigh for yourself. Whether or not Pillar 43 really is a calendar of catastrophe, the fact that we can stand in front of it 11,000 years later and argue the point in earnest is its own kind of marvel. The third theory is older as an idea than Göbekli Tepe is as a discovery, and its most famous living champion is the British writer Graham Hancock, who has argued it across a shelf of best-selling books and, more recently, in front of very large television audiences. Here is the case at full strength, because it deserves a fair hearing. During the last ice age, With so much of the world's water locked up in glaciers, the seas stood hundreds of feet lower than they do now, and vast stretches of coastline that today lie underwater were dry, fertile, livable land. Hancock proposes that somewhere out on those drowned coasts, a genuinely advanced culture grew up. Not spaceships and skyscrapers, but seafarers and astronomers and master builders, generations ahead of the scattered hunter-gatherers around them. Then, at the end of the Ice Age, in that same younger Dryas window of catastrophe, the world turned over. Rapid melting, seas climbing fast, great floods, perhaps comet strikes, drowning that culture's coastal heartland and scrubbing away almost every trace of it. The survivors, he argues, scattered inland and across the world, carrying what they knew, the building, the sky watching, the first seeds of farming, and they handed it to the simpler peoples they washed up among. And this is the point where Göbekli Tepe walks on stage. To Hancock, a site this sophisticated, this early, built by people the textbooks file under simple foragers, does not look like a beginning at all. It looks like an inheritance. The hunter-gatherers, in his telling, did not dream this up out of nothing. They were taught by the refugees of a lost world, and Göbekli Tepe is one of the first places that older knowledge breaks back up through the surface. He points to the planning, the precision, the astronomy people read into the carvings, and he asks the question that does a lot of work for him. Where is the apprenticeship? Where are the clumsy early tries, the failed first drafts? Why does this appear so suddenly and so accomplished? It is, as a story, genuinely gripping, and it pulls on a very old human ache, the dream of a golden age lost under the water, that we have spent the rest of history half remembering. And then you climb down into the dig, and you look hard at what is actually in the ground. Flint blades, grinding stones, the butchered bones of wild gazelle and boar and aurochs, charcoal from old cooking fires, stone tools by the thousand, caught at every stage of being made. What you do not find is one single trace of the advanced teachers. No metal, no writing, no machinery, no fine goods carried in from a drowned homeland, nothing a local community with stone tools and a great deal of skill could not have made for themselves. And that missing apprenticeship Hancock asks about turns out to be there after all. It is just spread across the whole region, in the plainer, older sites and the everyday tools nearby that show people working their way up to this, step by patient step, exactly the way you would expect if they figured it out for themselves. So it is a captivating idea on very thin ground, worth turning over as you drift off tonight, but the stones keep insisting, chip by chip, that they were made by local hands, learning as they went. And the fourth theory is, by a wide margin, the most famous of all four, the one nearly everyone listening has heard some version of. It is the idea that Göbekli Tepe was raised with help from somewhere beyond the Earth, ancient aliens. The theory has a proper name, the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and a founding father, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken, whose book Chariots of the Gods sold in the tens of millions and planted one sticky idea in the popular mind. The idea is this: that the great wonders of the ancient world were simply too advanced for the people who supposedly built them. So those people must have had help from visitors who came down out of the sky. Göbekli Tepe, surfacing so old and so accomplished, became a natural new exhibit for that argument, and it has been a fixture of the late-night television version of history ever since. Let's give it its strongest form, because the question underneath it really is a fair one. Look at what the place demanded. Pillars weighing many tons, cut from solid rock, carved with fine detail, lifted and lined up with real care by people with no metal, no wheel, no draft animals, and no writing to carry the plans from one mind to the next. How, the proponents ask, could Stone Age hunter-gatherers possibly have managed engineering on that scale? The precision looks too good, the scale too large, the date far too early. Something this far ahead of its time, they argue, needs an outside hand. And then they point straight at the stones themselves. Those tall, central pillars, the ones with the long-fingered hands and the carved belts, are not ancestors or guardians at all, the proponents say. They are portraits of the visitors, towering, faceless beings, set down in stone by the awestruck people they came to. The animals become the visitors' emblems. The whole ring becomes a monument to contact. And the early date, to them, is the clincher, the supposed smoking gun. How else, they ask, could people fresh out of the Ice Age read the heavens or move stone like this, unless someone from elsewhere had shown them how? Here is where it lands, and it is the same ground the lost civilization story came to rest on. Every single object ever lifted out of that hill is human and earthly. Every chip of worked flint, every animal bone, every tool, every mark on every pillar is exactly what you would expect from human hands. Stone tools, rope, earth ramps, and an enormous amount of patient time. There is no scrap of alien metal, no cut that human tools could not make, no material from off the planet, nothing at all that needs a visitor to explain it. And the famous impossibility is not really one. We know it can be done without metal because it was done, and the plainer, older sites scattered across the same region show, step by step, people building up the skill to do it. The honest answer to how could Stone Age people possibly have managed this turns out to be the least mysterious answer in the world. They were a great deal cleverer and a great deal more capable than we have ever given them credit for. And there is something a little sad in handing the achievement to the stars, because the moment you do, you take the single most astonishing thing human beings ever pulled off this early, and you hand the credit to somebody else. The truth is the better story. People did this. People who had not yet invented the wheel did this with their own hands by working together on a cold hill at the edge of the world. I would much rather lie here amazed by them than by anybody from another planet. So what became of it? After all of that, the quarrying, the carving, the hauling, the feasting, the rings of Göbekli Tepe were filled in, packed with rubble and earth and old bones, until the giant stone people were buried up to their shoulders once more, and the hill closed over the top of them. And the reason why is, you will not be surprised to hear by now, argued over. For a long time, The answer was that they did it on purpose, a deliberate burial, a careful covering over, for reasons of their own. Newer work suggests it may be messier than that. Slopes washing down, walls collapsing, buildings repaired and half buried and built over again across a long, slow life, until the earth finally took the whole thing. Not one dramatic ending, but a long biography that simply wound down. And here is the part that turns it from a sad story into a strange and wonderful one. That burial is the only reason you get to hear about this place at all. A ring of carved stone left standing out in the open weathers, down to nothing in a few thousand years. Rain and frost and wind blur the foxes, blunt the vultures, topple the pillars, but buried it kept. Sealed under that pot-bellied hill, the carvings stayed as crisp as the day they were cut, the snakes still pouring, the vulture's wing still raised, waiting in the dark for 11,500 years, until a man who had read an old survey note came up the slope to look twice. And it turns out it was never alone up there, either. Just a few miles off sits another site, Göbekli Tepe, with carved pillars of its own and stranger carvings still being uncovered. And beyond that, a whole scattering of related sites across that corner of Turkey, which the people who study them have started calling the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. Göbekli Tepe was not one miracle dropped onto an empty plain. It was the most famous building in a whole world of building, a wide community of people spread across a wide stretch of country, all reaching toward the same idea, with stone, at the same astonishing moment in the human story. Whatever moved them to do it, it moved a lot of them, across a lot of hills, for a very long time. There is a roof over it now, a wide modern shelter, a walkway that carries visitors out above the rings, a museum down the road in the city of Şanlıurfa, and a place on the official list of the most important sites in the world. You could go. It is a real spot, on a real map, open to anyone who makes the trip. The foxes are still there on the stone. The vulture is still there, wing still raised. And 11,500 years after a few hundred hunter-gatherers cut those figures out of the hill, you can stand at the railing, look one of those tall stone people in its blank, patient, faceless top, know almost nothing about why it was made, and feel anyway that somehow you recognize it. So let that be the last picture tonight. The rings of standing stones under their shelter, and in the middle of each circle, the two tall figures facing each other, the carved hand reaching toward the carved hand across the gap, long fingers nearly touching, the way they have nearly touched since before there were farms, or cities, or writing, or wheels. The people who made them are gone. Their names, their language, their gods, the meaning of every fox and snake and vulture, all of it has slipped too far back for us to follow. But the work is still here. The hands are gone. The thing the hands made remains, close enough to touch, too old to read. That is where we will leave it for tonight. The lights are low, the blanket is warm, your feet are tucked in. There is nothing left to do now but breathe slow and let yourself drift, while up on a pale ridge, 11,500 years ago, a few hundred people you will never meet finish raising a ring of stone, and the earth begins to close over it for the long, long wait until somebody comes back up the hill to find it again. Sleep well. We'll be right here tomorrow night with another one. Let's go back to the year 1587 to a low green island at the edge of a brand new world. To understand how 117 people ended up alone on that island, you have to start with a queen, a rivalry, and a man who was better with a paintbrush than a sword. In 1587, England was a small, ambitious country with a large problem named Spain. Spain had reached the New World first. Spanish ships were sailing home heavy with silver, and the Spanish king was spending that silver on the biggest navy in the world. England wanted in, not out of pure curiosity, out of survival and a healthy interest in other people's silver. Queen Elizabeth I could not afford to build a colony out of her own treasury, so she did what monarchs have always done when they want something expensive without paying for it. She let someone else take the risk. That someone was Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier, adventurer, and a man with the sort of confidence that earns you either a statue or a beheading. In the end, he got both. Raleigh was given a royal charter to claim land in America for England, but he never set foot there himself. He was more of an ideas man. The man who actually went, more than once, was named John White. And here is the first thing that makes this story different from the grim, armored expeditions you might be picturing. John White was an artist, a painter. On earlier voyages, he had sailed this same coast and made watercolors, careful, astonishingly accurate paintings of the land and of the native people who already lived there. He painted their villages, their canoes, the fishing weirs they built in the rivers, the way they cooked and farmed and danced. 400 years later, those paintings are still the clearest window we have into that world. John White did not arrive on the coast of Carolina as a conqueror. He came, at least at first, as a man trying to see the place properly. In 1587, Raleigh put White in charge of a new kind of settlement. Not a fort packed with soldiers. England had tried exactly that on this same island 2 years earlier, and it had gone badly. This time, it was families. Men, women, and children. Farmers, a few craftsmen, 2 wives who were already pregnant. 117 people in all, according to the National Park Service. They were not raiding. They were moving in. They packed tools and seeds and cooking pots and all the heavy, hopeful clutter of people who fully intend to stay. Their plan was to settle further north, around the Chesapeake Bay, where the water was deeper and the harbors were better. Roanoke Island was only supposed to be a stop along the way, a place to collect a small handful of Englishmen left behind by the earlier expedition, say hello, and keep sailing north. It did not work out that way, though. When the ships reached Roanoke, the colonists got the bad news that they were not going any further. For reasons they could not control, the fleet would carry them no closer to the Chesapeake. Roanoke was not the doorway to their new home. Roanoke was the home now, ready or not. So they made the best of a place that was never meant to be theirs. And it is worth slowing down to picture where they actually were, because Roanoke is nothing like the easy green farmland the word colony tends to suggest. This is the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a long, thin chain of sandy barrier islands strung along the coast like a loose thread. Low dunes, salt grass, twisted little forests bent flat by the wind off the sea. Behind the islands lie wide, shallow sounds. Between the islands and the open ocean lie sandbars that shift in the night and tear the bottoms out of ships. Fresh water is hard to find. In places you have to dig down into the sand of the dunes to reach any at all. It is a beautiful place and a difficult one, and in 1587 it was a very long way from anyone who could help you. Into that place, the colonists unpacked their lives. From the first day, there was work, and plenty of it. They rebuilt and repaired the houses the earlier expedition had left behind, patching roofs and walls against the wind that came off the sea and never quite stopped. They cleared and worked the thin, sandy ground and put in what crops they could. There was wood to gather, meals to cook over open fires, nets and lines to work along the shallows, and the slow, constant business of turning a rough camp into something like a home. 2 of the women were far along in pregnancy, carrying children in a place with no doctor and no midwife but one another, and no help of any kind within 1,000 miles of salt water. There were small children, too, learning to walk on sand instead of on English grass. It was a full and demanding life, lived from first light, by people who had crossed an ocean and now had to wring a living out of a coast they barely knew. And about 2 weeks after they arrived, on the 18th of August, 1587, a woman named Eleanor Dare, John White's own daughter, gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Virginia. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in this part of the New World. And from this night on, I want you to keep her in the back of your mind, because she is our clock. Hold on to her birthday, the 18th of August. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to matter. Because almost as soon as Virginia was born, the colony ran straight into the problem that would shape everything that came after. They simply did not have enough supplies to last the year. 117 people on a sandbar, with winter on the way, and not enough food in the stores. Someone was going to have to sail all the way back to England and return with more. And the obvious person, the one with the standing, the contacts, and the trust on both sides of the ocean, was the governor himself, John White. White did not want to go. He had just become a grandfather 9 days earlier. Leaving meant crossing the Atlantic twice over and leaving his daughter and his newborn granddaughter on an island at the very edge of the map. But the colonists pressed him hard. If anyone could make certain the supply ships actually came back, it was the man whose name was on the charter. So, on the 27th of August, 1587, barely a week after Virginia was born, John White got back on a ship and sailed east toward England, promising to return as fast as wind and weather would let him. He had no way of knowing how long it would actually be before he made it back to the colony. Here is where the ocean stops being a road and turns into a wall. White reached England, and he set about organizing a relief voyage at once. And the timing could not have been worse. Because in 1588, England and Spain went to war. The big one, the one with the Armada, the enormous Spanish invasion fleet that came sailing up the English Channel to put an end to Elizabeth's reign. When your whole country is bracing to be invaded, the Queen needs every ship she owns. A little rescue mission to a sandbar on the far side of the Atlantic drops straight to the bottom of the list. Ships were held back for the war, and White's plans went nowhere. He kept trying anyway. He scraped together what he could, more than once, and more than once it came to nothing. Turned back by war, by weather, by crews who were far more interested in chasing Spanish treasure than in delivering flour to a stranded colony. Year after year, the sailing season opened and then closed again, and he was still on the wrong side of the sea. Somewhere across that ocean, White's daughter and granddaughter were living a whole life he could not see. If all was well, Virginia learned to crawl, and then to stand, and then to walk. And her grandfather was 3,000 miles of salt water away, stuck in a country at war, watching every sailing season slip past without him. He was not careless. He was not a man who abandoned his family. He was a grandfather doing everything a grandfather could possibly do, while a war he had no part in kept every ship he needed tied up in port. By the time John White finally got a ship turned back toward Roanoke, the year was 1590. Virginia Dare, if she was alive, was no longer a baby. She was about to turn 3. White's ship reached the Outer Banks in August of 1590, almost exactly 3 years after he had sailed away. As it happened, he came back right around the 18th of August, right around Virginia's 3rd birthday. I told you we would come back to that date. Here we are. Getting ashore was an ordeal in itself. As the ship came in toward the island, the men aboard saw smoke rising from the trees. To a man who had crossed an ocean carrying nothing but hope, smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, and people meant his family might still be alive a short row away. They steered for it. But the water in the Sounds is shallow and unforgiving, and the weather turned. One of the small boats they were using to cross from the ship to the shore overturned in the rough water near the beach. 7 men drowned within sight of the island they had come to rescue. White and the rest pressed on anyway, not because they were brave, but because his daughter and his granddaughter might be just past the tree line, and what else does a man do? By the time they finally got ashore, the light was going. White and his men climbed up toward the settlement in the last of the day, and here he did something that tells you everything about what was in his chest. He had a trumpet sounded, a long, clear English trumpet call into the trees, and when nothing came back, the men began to sing. Familiar English songs, the tunes from home sung at full voice into the dark woods, so that any colonist who heard them would know that these were friends coming up the path, not raiders. They sang to the forest. No voice answered them. In the morning, White walked into the settlement, and what he found was not a battlefield. This matters, so hold on to it. There were no bodies, there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no burned ruins. Instead, there was something stranger. The houses were gone, not burned where they stood, but taken carefully apart and carried away board by board. Around the spot where the settlement had been, the colonists had built a high wall of whole tree trunks, a palisade, the kind of thing you build slowly and on purpose, not in a panic. Heavy iron and lead goods lay scattered in the grass and going to rust, the things too heavy to carry. And when White went to the place where 3 years earlier, he had buried his own chests for safekeeping, his books, his maps, his pictures, his armor. He found that they had been dug up, not by his colonists, it seemed, but by someone after them. His books were ruined. His armor was eaten through with rust. His careful paintings of that coast lay spoiled in the wet sand. It was the strangest kind of scene. Not violent, not bloody, just empty and tidy and deliberate. Wherever the 117 had gone, they do not seem to have been dragged. They seem to have packed. And then White saw the carving on the post. Before John White had sailed away 3 years earlier, he and the colonists had agreed on a plan, a simple one. If they ever had to leave Roanoke and move somewhere else, they would carve the name of the place they were going into a tree or a post, so that White would know where to follow. And they added one more rule on top of it. If they were ever driven out by force, by attack, by hunger, by some disaster, they would carve a cross above the name. The cross was the distress signal. The cross meant something went wrong. So White, walking through that empty, dismantled settlement, was not just looking at the wreckage of his hopes. He was reading. He was looking for a message he had helped design. And he found it. First, on a tree near the entrance, 3 letters cut into the bark, C-R-O. And then, on one of the great posts of the palisade, at the height of a man's eye, carved clean and clear in full capital letters, Croatoan. Now, to us, 400 years later and raised on ghost stories, that word lands like a curse. But to John White, standing right there, it was nothing of the kind. Croatoan was not a riddle. Croatoan was a place. It was a real island to the south, what we now call Hatteras, and it was home to a real people, the Croatoan, who were friendly to the colonists and whose leader, a man named Manteo, had actually sailed to England and back and was an ally. White read that word and understood it exactly as it was meant. We have gone to Croatoan. Follow us there. And here is the detail that should settle something in your chest before you sleep. There was no cross. White looked and looked again and found none carved anywhere. By the rule he had set himself, that meant the colonists had not fled in terror. They had not been burned out or driven off. They had left on their own terms, in their own time, calmly enough to take their houses apart and build a wall and carve a clear forwarding address into a post. The most famous word in this entire mystery was never a scream. It was a note left for a grandfather. Gone to Croatoan. Come find us. Before we go any further, we should slow down and meet the people whose name was carved on that post. For 400 years, the Croatoan have mostly been treated as the answer to an English riddle, a spooky word, a place a colony disappeared into. But they were not a word. They were a nation of living people, and they had been on that coast for a very long time before any English ship came over the horizon. The Croatoan were one of the coastal Algonquian peoples of what is now North Carolina. They lived on the Barrier Islands and along the Sounds, in towns, real towns, with houses built on frames of bent saplings and covered with bark and woven mats, set among worked fields and trees. They grew corn, beans, and squash. They fished the shallow sounds with nets and with long fences of stakes built out into the water, called weirs, that funneled the fish into one place. They made dugout canoes by burning and scraping out the trunks of big trees, and they took those canoes across water the English found frightening as easily as you or I would walk down a familiar street. They made pottery and beads of shell and copper, and they traded up and down the coast along routes that were old before England knew this land was here. We even know what their world looked like because we have pictures. Remember John White, the painter, from the start of our story? On his earlier voyage in 1585, before he was ever a governor, White sat down in these towns and painted the people in front of him. A man fishing, a woman holding her child, a whole village laid out with its houses and its fields and its cooking fires, a dance, a shared meal. He painted them as people going about an ordinary day. Those watercolors survive, and they are the closest, truest look we have at this world, made by someone who actually stood there and watched. So when you picture the Croatoan tonight, picture White's paintings. Not a costume, not a shadow at the edge of a ghost story, but families living a full life on a coast they knew better than anyone alive. That 1585 voyage is also where the two worlds first really met, and it is worth knowing how that went, because it was not all friendly. The English had come to this coast a couple of years before the lost colony. That earlier settlement we mentioned, the one full of soldiers. And the soldiers did what unsupplied soldiers far from home have a long habit of doing. They leaned hard on the local people for food. Tempers frayed, and before it was over, there was violence. And there were deaths. By 1587, some of the nearby nations had very good reasons not to trust an Englishman at all. So the friendships that did survive were not a given. They were rare, and they were worth a great deal. And the steadiest of them was with the Croatoan. A great deal of that came down to one man. His name was Manteo. Manteo was a Croatoan man, from the very island the colonists would later name on that post. And some years before the lost colony ever set sail, Manteo did something that almost no one on that coast had ever done. He boarded an English ship and crossed the whole Atlantic Ocean to England. He walked through London. He met the people there, he learned their language, and then he sailed all the way back home again. By the time the 1587 families arrived, Manteo could move between two worlds. He spoke English, he understood the English, and he was trusted on both sides. He was the bridge between them. So hold that in your mind, because it changes the shape of everything that comes next. When those colonists were stranded and running low on food, the people whose name they cut into that post were not strangers, and they were not a horror waiting in the dark. They were neighbors, and in a place where the English had already made enemies, they were the neighbors who had stayed friends. They had towns and food and boats and a deep knowledge of how to live on that coast. And in Manteo, they had a man who already stood with one foot in each world. Gone to Croatoan was not a step into the unknown. It was a walk toward the people best placed to take them in. Which brings us back to John White, standing in that emptied settlement with the carved word in front of him. He had read it correctly. His people had gone to friends, not into the dark, and to find them He only had to follow them south to Croatoan. But the ships he had crossed on were not his to command. The only way White had managed to get back across the Atlantic in 1590 was aboard a pair of privateering vessels, whose crews were really out hunting Spanish treasure ships and treated the rescue of a stranded colony as a side errand, something to tolerate, not a cause of their own. And so he decided to follow the word. Croatoan was south of him. Hatteras Island, a sail down the coast, and that was where it pointed. White and the crew agreed to set sail in the morning and steer for Croatoan to find the colonists. After 3 years, after the 7 men drowned in the surf, after the ruined camp, he was finally one short voyage away from his daughter and his granddaughter. He never got there. That night, the weather turned hard against them. A storm came up off the coast, the same kind of weather that makes these waters so deadly, and it battered the ships through the dark. Anchors were lost. Cables snapped. By the time it eased, the vessels were damaged, the fresh water was running low, and the food was nearly gone. The crew had had enough. Treasure, not rescue, was what had brought them across, and they would not risk the ships any longer for one more try at a sandbar. They overruled the governor. Instead of turning south toward Croatoan, they turned the bows east, out toward open water, meaning to resupply and come back another season. They did not come back. The ships carried John White away from that coast for the last time. He crossed the Atlantic once more, the wrong way, and he never set foot in America again. He spent his last years far from all of it, on an estate in Ireland, an old man writing down what he had seen. As far as we know, he died there, around the year 1593. And he died not knowing. He never learned whether his daughter Eleanor was alive. He never learned what became of little Virginia, the granddaughter whose 3rd birthday he had sailed back to share. He had crossed an ocean for her and come within a single island of the answer. And the sea turned him around and kept it from him for the rest of his life. That carved word was the last of them he would ever have. Gone to Croatoan. He believed it. He simply never got to follow it home. So let's deal, right here, with the version of this story you have probably been told. Because between that carved post in 1590 and you, lying in bed tonight, 4 centuries of people have gotten hold of this tale and dressed it up in a bedsheet. Start with the most common line of all, that the colonists vanished without a trace. It is a wonderful phrase, and it is simply not true. They did not vanish, and they did not leave no trace. They left a dismantled settlement, a deliberately built wall, 2 separate carvings naming exactly where they were headed, and a pointed absence of any distress signal. That is not without a trace. That is one of the clearest forwarding notices anyone has ever left behind. The mystery was never that there was no clue. The mystery is what happened after they followed it. Then there is the word itself, Croatoan, treated as if it were some dark incantation. A curse, a demon's name, a supernatural message. It was not. We just covered this. It was the name of an island and the people who lived on it, written down by a man who recognized it instantly. Spooky packaging, added centuries later by people who liked the chill of it. Underneath the packaging is a place on a map. You may also hear about the Dare stones. In the 1930s, a stone turned up near a river in North Carolina, carved with what claimed to be a message from Eleanor Dare herself, Virginia's mother, telling the sad fate of the colony. And then, after a reward was offered, more stones appeared. Many more. Over 40 of them, eventually. And here is the trouble. That flood of later stones was exposed as a hoax, carved by people chasing the reward money. As for the very first stone, the one found before the reward, historians still argue about it, and it remains disputed. Not proven real, not cleanly proven fake. We name the Dare stones. We call the bulk of them what they are, a hoax, and we set the rest aside as unsettled. We do not build the ending of our story on a rock that cannot hold the weight. And finally, there is the legend of the White Doe, a later folk tale in which Virginia Dare grows up among the native people, is transformed by magic into a white deer, and is killed by a silver arrow. It is a lovely, sad piece of coastal folklore. It is also exactly that, folklore, invented long afterward. It is not a record of what happened to the real child born on that island. We can enjoy it as a campfire story and still keep it well away from the evidence. With the ghosts cleared off the porch, we can finally ask the real question. Not what cursed them. Just this. 117 people left a note saying they had gone to Croatoan. So where did they actually end up, and what became of them? There are several possible answers to that question, and none of them is proven. But they are not all equally strong. So let me lay them out in order, beginning with the one the evidence leans toward hardest. The first and strongest is the simplest one. They did what their own carving said they did. They went to Croatoan, to Hatteras Island, and they went to live among the Croatoan people. Think about their situation. They were short on food, abandoned by their supply ships, facing another winter on a thin strip of sand. And a day's travel away were people they already knew, who already farmed and fished these waters and knew how to live here, and whose leader had been to England and was their friend. For hungry, stranded families, that is not a horror story. That is the obvious, sensible thing to do. You go to the neighbors who can keep you alive. And the ground itself has started to back this up. In recent years, archaeologists digging on Hatteras Island, where Croatoan once stood, have pulled late 16th century European objects out of the earth, mixed right in with the native settlement. A piece of a sword hilt, a writing slate and a lead pencil, the tools of literate English people. A fragment of fine German pottery, a small bronze counting token from the city of Nuremberg, a ring. These are not the sort of things that wash up by accident. They are the everyday possessions of English colonists, found in the homes of the Croatoan people, in exactly the place the carved post pointed to. The most likely reading is the gentlest one, that some of the lost colonists really did go to Hatteras and were taken in, and over the years became part of that community, married into it, raised children in it, and disappeared from English history, not because they died, but because they became someone else's family. The second theory does not contradict the first. It sits right beside it. It is the idea that the colonists split up, and that some of them moved inland away from the coast. We actually have White's own words for this. He wrote that before he left, the colonists had talked about moving 50 miles into the main, 50 miles inland into the interior. And there are clues out that way too. Modern researchers re-examined one of John White's own maps and found, hidden beneath a patch of paper glued onto it, a small drawing of a fort marking a spot well inland near the rivers. Digs in that area have turned up 16th century English pottery as well, the kind of household goods that suggest a small group of English people living there, at least for a while. It is not the whole colony, and it does not tell us how their story ended, but it fits a picture where the 117 did not stay one single group, but broke into smaller parties and went where each could survive. So the two strongest answers both point the same direction, and it is not toward a curse. It is toward people scattering, on purpose, toward places they could live. There are two darker possibilities, and we should weigh them plainly for what they are. The first is that some of the colonists were killed or captured. Years later, when the English finally founded a colony that lasted, Jamestown, further north in Virginia, settlers there heard reports. Rumors of people inland who dressed or lived like Europeans, and other rumors, grimmer ones, that a powerful local leader had killed a group of these strangers. The trouble with all of it is that these are later stories collected years after the fact, second and third hand, by people who had every reason to repeat a dramatic tale. They are not eyewitness records of 1590. Could some of the colonists, especially a small splinter group cut off from allies, have come to a bad end through hunger, sickness, or conflict? Yes, some could have. But could have is the whole of it. There is no solid proof that the colony was massacred, and the lurid version of that story usually leans on those dare stones we already set aside. The second dark possibility is the loneliest one. When White searched the empty settlement, he noted that the colonists' small boats were gone, which leaves open a lonely, sad thought that at some point some of them tried to sail, maybe down the coast, maybe, in desperation, out toward the open Atlantic and England itself, in boats far too small for that ocean. If anyone tried that, the sea would have taken them, and there would be no carving, no artifact, no trace at all. We have nothing that shows this actually happened. It is the most speculative idea in the whole story, a possibility we can name, not a fact we can stand on. But the missing boats leave the door open just a crack, and so we mention it, and then we let it be. 4 roads, then, leading out of that empty settlement. Live with the Croatoan, scatter inland, come to harm, or sail away and be lost. None of them is proven, but they are not evenly matched, and when you set them side by side, 3 of the 4 are thin, and one of them is supported by tools in the ground. So where does that leave us, lying here in the dark 400 years downstream? It leaves us with a record that simply runs out. We cannot tell you, for certain, what became of all 117 of them. We cannot tell you what happened to Eleanor Dare, or to her husband Ananias, or to the little girl whose birthday we have been carrying this whole way. Virginia, who would have turned 3 the very week her grandfather came back to an empty island and a carved post. That part is true. Some doors in history stay shut. But "we don't know everything" is not the same as "they vanished into nothing." When you clear away the curses and the cursed stones and the white deer, and you look at what is actually in the ground and in the records, the weight of the evidence points one way, and it is the most human way of all. These were not people swallowed by a spell. They were families who ran out of help and made a hard, sensible choice. They took their houses apart, they wrote down where they were going, and they walked toward the people most likely to keep them alive through the winter. The strongest clues we have, the carved word, the sword hilt, and the writing slate in a Croatoan village, the English pottery inland, all point not toward an ending, but toward a beginning somewhere else. Not death in the dark. A new life, in a new community, under a new name, fading out of one people's story by becoming part of another's. And there is something worth keeping about that. We tend to want our mysteries to end with a body or a villain. This one most likely ends with a meal shared, a roof offered, and children growing up on Hatteras Island who carried a little English and a lot of Croatoan in them, and never thought of themselves as lost at all. They only got that name from the people who couldn't find them. Today, if you stand on Hatteras Island, there is no palisade and no carved post. There is sand and seagrass and the same wide, shallow water the colonists once looked out over. Underneath it, every so often, somebody's spade turns up a 400-year-old token, or a bead, or a piece of a blade. Small, stubborn proof that English and Croatoan lives were once tangled together right there, on that beach, in a way the legend never made room for. That is where we will leave them tonight. Not in horror, and not without a trace, but on a sandy island at the edge of a new world, choosing to live. So let the questions settle. Let the island go dark behind you. The lights are already low. The blanket is warm. Your feet are tucked in. There is nothing left for you to solve tonight. Let it all go quiet and let yourself drift off. And we will be here to do this for you again tomorrow night. Sleep well.